My name is Elaine Hart. I am sex and sexy. And the night my own son sent me to sleep in the basement, like I was the help. I kept my voice steady and counted the steps between humiliation and a plan. He thought the house was already his. His wife smiled like it was, and her mother measured my kitchen like a realtor. But tucked away in a place none of them ever bothered to look, sat the one thing they never saw coming. I watched them move my wedding china, change the locks I paid for, and tell me not to worry, while a stranger at a title office tried to make my signature say yes. What would you do if your child treated you like a tenant in the home you built? And the only person who could stop it was the woman they assumed was too old to notice. How far would a mother go to take back her name on the deed? If you want to see how a basement turns into a war room and a whisper turns into a courtroom, come with me. I will show you the moment my silence ended and their story started to fall apart. The afternoon light spilled across the living room, warm and soft, making the lace curtains glow the same way they did 30 years ago when Frank and I first moved in. I had just finished trimming the roses in the backyard when my phone rang. It was Daniel. He never called in the middle of the day unless something was wrong. "Mom," he said, his voice unusually tight. "Our apartment's being renovated. They found mold in the ceiling. It's going to take a few weeks. Maybe months. Tracy and I were wondering if we could stay with you for a little while." I wiped my hands on my old gardening apron and smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Of course. Sweetheart. You and Tracy can stay as long as you need. You know this house always has room for you." He hesitated. "And Mom. Tracy's mom might come too. Just for a short bit. She's been helping us with Emma while Tracy's at work." My smile stiffened, but I forced my voice to stay calm. "Sure, Daniel. We'll make it work." When I hung up, I stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked around. Every corner of this house had a memory. Frank had built the wooden shelves himself. We'd spent our first Christmas here, eating canned soup and laughing because the oven didn't work. After he passed, the house became my heartbeat. I tended to it like I used to tend to him. The thought of filling it again with family almost felt comforting. Almost. They arrived 2 days later. The sound of their car pulling into the driveway, breaking the usual afternoon silence. Tracy came in first. Sunglasses still on. Hair perfect as always. "Oh my God. Maggie. You've kept everything the same," she said, setting down her designer tote. "It's nostalgic." Behind her, Daniel carried 2 heavy suitcases. "Hey, Mom," he said, hugging me quickly before moving past me toward the stairs. "Where should we put our stuff?" "Wherever you'd like," I said softly. "The guest room's ready. I even washed the sheets this morning." Then came Marilyn, slowly climbing the porch steps. "Hello, Margaret." She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This neighborhood's lovely. It'll be nice to have a bit more space." I took her coat, already feeling my chest tighten. "I'll make some tea." While the kettle boiled, Tracy wandered through the living room, touching things. "This piano must be." "What?" 50 years old, she said. "It's adorable. But maybe Daniel and I can help you modernize the place while we're here." I laughed softly. "Modernize, I kind of like it the way it is." Daniel called from upstairs. "Mom. Where do you keep the spare towels?" "Linen closet." "End of the hall," I shouted back. By evening, the kitchen was full of noise again. Marilyn set the table for 4, while Tracy unpacked takeout boxes. Daniel poured himself a beer from my fridge like it had always been his. It was strange, watching them move through my home so comfortably, like they'd always belonged. Dinner was loud. Tracy talked about her salon business. Marilyn complained about her knees, and Daniel barely looked at me. When I mentioned that the roses had finally bloomed this spring, no one responded. After dessert, Tracy clapped her hands together. "So, we were thinking, she said, exchanging a look with Daniel. Maybe we can rearrange the furniture tomorrow. The living room's got so much potential. Daniel could set up his workstation here. And I could use the dining area for my laptop and products. It'll be temporary. Of course. Of course. I repeated, even though my stomach twisted. Just don't move Frank's chair. It's special to me. Tracy's smile faltered for a second before she said, naturally. That night, when they'd all gone upstairs, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen. The clock ticked loud enough to fill the room. I looked around again, noticing for the first time how small everything suddenly felt. My teacup was empty. The roses outside still wet from watering. I told myself this was what family did. Helping each other when times got tough. I told myself it was fine. But the next morning, Daniel was in the living room with a tape measure, muttering about where to put a bigger TV. Tracy was on the phone with her salon assistant, pacing near the fireplace. Marilyn had opened my china cabinet, admiring pieces I'd collected with Frank during our travels. So pretty, she said, turning a delicate cup in her hands. But old-fashioned. I'd be terrified to break it. I reached out and took it gently from her. Then maybe don't touch it. She blinked, pretending to laugh. But her eyes hardened. You're touchy. Margaret, maybe you need more rest. Daniel said you've been alone too long. That can make a person cranky. That night, Daniel approached me after dinner. Mom. About the space, he began, rubbing the back of his neck. Tracy and I talked. And we think it'd be best if you took the basement for a bit. It's warmer in winter. Easier on your knees. And you'll have your own bathroom. My fork froze midway to my mouth. The basement. He nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Yeah. It just makes sense for now. You'll have privacy. And we'll stay upstairs so Emma can nap without noise. I set my fork down carefully. Daniel, I raised you in this house. Every inch of it belongs to both of us in memory. Why would you think I should live in the basement? He sighed, his voice tightening. It's not permanent. Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. Tracy's mom will take the guest room. You'll be more comfortable downstairs. Marilyn added softly. It's really for your own good. Dear. You're older now. Fewer stairs will be better. I looked at each of them. Tracy avoided my eyes. Daniel stared back. Firm and cold. I wanted to fight. To shout. But the words stuck in my throat. I finally nodded. Fine. If that's what you think is best. Daniel exhaled with relief, mistaking surrender for agreement. Thanks. Mom. You'll see. It'll be easier. That night, I stood at the top of the basement stairs, holding a small box of clothes, staring into the dim space below. The air smelled like paint and dust. I took one step down, then another. The door closed softly behind me. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the faint laughter upstairs. Then I whispered to myself, looks like I'm home. The concrete held a chill that crept into my ankles while I shuffled around the basement with an armful of blankets. I found an old lamp in a cardboard box, marked winter, and dusted the shade with the palm of my hand until the light came through in a warm oval. The pull chain clicked twice before the bulb steadied. In the glow, the room looked smaller than it had last night. The utility sink, the washer and dryer, the metal shelves that Frank once swore he would replace. All of it crowding in on the narrow bed I had made out of a daybed frame and quilts. I unpacked like a guest at my own address. 2 sweaters into the top drawer. A framed picture of Frank and me on our first trip to Door County, propped against the cinder block wall. The sewing tin with my thimbles set carefully on the shelf above the washer. I told myself to keep moving. Just put one thing away. Then another. And pretend this was a choice. Footsteps crossed the kitchen above me. Cabinets opened and closed. A chair scraped. I took a breath and climbed the stairs to make coffee. The kitchen smelled like someone else's morning. Tracy stood at the island with my spice rack turned sideways, lining up jars as if they were shampoo bottles. Daniel had a tape measure stretched across the living room archway, calling out numbers under his breath. Marilyn had the refrigerator open and was rearranging leftovers into matching plastic containers I did not own. "Good morning," I said, without waiting for anyone to look up. I reached for my mug in the far cabinet and found the shelf empty. Tracy said it was more efficient to keep everyday cups by the dishwasher now. She handed me a mug that said "Rise and Grind" in curly letters. I nodded and thanked her and poured coffee like it did not burn my tongue. Daniel folded the tape measure and slid it into his pocket. He told me the delivery people were coming by noon with a sectional he had found on sale. He said the old sofa could go to the garage for a while. I asked about Frank's chair, and Daniel said he could have it wrapped to keep it safe. He spoke to the air. Not to me. The way men talk when they have already decided. Marilyn closed the refrigerator and patted my shoulder. She said I would be more comfortable downstairs and that not climbing stairs would be good for my hips. She said being older came with adjustments and routines. I smiled the way you do at someone who thinks they are being kind. By late morning, there were boxes everywhere. Tracy had her laptop open on the dining table with a row of hairspray samples beside it. She took a call on speaker and walked in circles while she talked about client retention and bridal packages. Daniel brought in a flat screen and set it against the wall by the fireplace. He told me he needed a quiet place to take calls and that the living room had the best light for video. I asked where I should sit to read in the evening, and he said we would figure it out. Then he asked if I could please keep the kitchen counter clear so the delivery team had space. I made sandwiches for lunch because feeding people is what my hands still know how to do. When I set a plate in front of Tracy, she said they had already ordered poke bowls and that she was watching her carbs. Daniel took a half anyway and ate it standing up. Marilyn asked for extra pickles and then told me the pickles I buy are too sweet. I ate my sandwich by the sink and watched the rhythm of their day take over mine. The delivery truck showed up a little after 1. 2 men carried the sectional up the porch and through my front door while Tracy directed traffic. Daniel told them to plant it facing the fireplace and then asked me to hold the door while they took the old sofa out. When the door swung shut, the living room looked like a model home in a catalog I did not subscribe to. The piano looked smaller. Frank's chair sat where the couch had been, wrapped in a gray blanket, like a person who had gone cold. Tracy clapped her hands and said, "Look how open it feels." Daniel smiled at her and at the room, and for a second, I saw my boy again. Pleased he had made something happen. In the late afternoon, Tracy texted someone, and the doorbell rang, and then 2 of her friends were in my kitchen, laughing about a new hair extension supplier. I reached for the kettle, and Daniel asked if I could make tea later. He said the baby, Emma, was on her way and would nap on the sofa, and the kettle whistle might wake her. I started to say, "This is my house," and then swallowed the words like aspirin without water. I set the kettle down and folded the dish towel in half. Then in half again, until my thumbs hurt. By 5 o'clock, Daniel's hands were black with whatever lives on the backs of televisions. He washed up and came to the top of the basement stairs and told me dinner would be late. He said they were having a couple people over and that it might be easier if I stayed downstairs to avoid the mess. He said he would bring me a plate. I told him I could come up, that I was not sick. He said it was about space and flow and that guests got nervous around older people who move slowly. I stared at the banister and told myself to breathe through my nose. I went back down and straightened the quilts. Music started upstairs. Not loud, but steady. Laughter rose and fell. Silverware chimed on plates. The house sounded like it did years ago when Daniel brought home friends after football practice and stomped through the kitchen like a colt. I pressed my palm to the cold wall and thought about the girls I taught to hem skirts at the shop. About their shy smiles when they made something fit. A little later, the door at the top of the stairs opened, and a paper plate appeared with a napkin half tucked under it. Tracy's polished hand held it there without looking down. I took it and said thank you to a door. The next morning I folded my quilt and made the bed with the corners tucked tight, the way nurses taught me when Frank had his surgeries. I went upstairs for coffee and found a note on the refrigerator written in Tracy's neat script. Kitchen quiet after 9 at night. No heavy cooking before 10 in the morning. Please text before running appliances. Below that, Daniel had added another line. Please knock if baby is sleeping. I stood with my hand on the refrigerator handle and let the cold creep into my palm until my skin stung. Then, I poured coffee and sat at the small table beside the back door and watched a hummingbird fight with its reflection in the window. By mid-morning, a laundry bag thumped down the basement stairs and landed at my feet. Socks and workout clothes spilled across the bottom step. A tangle of elastic and sweat. Tracy called out from the kitchen that the washer was down there anyway, and would I mind since I was closest. She said she had a full day of clients, and it would be a lifesaver. I stared at the pile and thought of the years I taught Daniel to sort darks from lights. I picked up a t-shirt, and it smelled like eucalyptus and the faint metal of a gym. I told myself it was just a favor like any mother would do. When I carried the basket to the washer, a sock fell, and I bent to pick it up and felt the pinch in my lower back, remind me that time has its own opinions. As the machine spun, I went upstairs to check the mail. A stack sat on the hall table. Daniel reached for it the same moment I did and said he would take care of the bills. He slipped a few envelopes under his arm and handed me a flyer for a neighborhood art fair. He told me he was organizing things so nothing would slip through the cracks. I said, I have been paying bills since before he was born. He smiled like a teacher with a difficult student and said he meant well. He told me not to worry about a thing and that he would make decisions that kept the house running. I asked what decisions needed to be made. He said small things, and that it was better if I did not stress. He said change is hard but necessary. He paused, and his voice lost all of its polite edges. He said if I did not like how the house was running, maybe I should think about a place that suits me better. He said there were plenty of senior options nearby, with elevators and dining halls. He said it would be good for me. He said it like a solution. Like a gift wrapped in paper I did not choose. I felt my mouth go dry. I turned the envelopes in my hands until the paper softened at the corners. I told him I would be downstairs finishing the laundry. He nodded and thanked me and walked away, already looking at his phone. Back in the basement, the washer buzzed and I moved damp clothes into the dryer. I added a dryer sheet out of habit and shut the door. The lamp on the metal shelf hummed like a quiet voice in another room. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the drum turn. A slow circle. Again and again. Upstairs, a chair scraped. Then the soft tread of feet crossing a floor that used to belong to me. I let my shoulders drop. I decided I would not fight a conversation designed to make me small. I would watch. I would listen. I would remember. The house had gone quiet again. The kind of quiet that presses against your ribs. The basement light flickered when I pulled the chain. The air thick with detergent and damp concrete. I sat on the edge of the bed and told myself not to cry. That this was temporary. That mothers endure worse. The washer thumped softly behind me. Its rhythm, the only sound that still belonged to me. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I could hear the pipes creak as the shower ran upstairs. The smell of bacon drifted down, then stopped just as quickly. When I climbed up to make coffee, the kitchen was spotless. The bacon gone, and the dishwasher running. A note sat on the counter. Daniel had written, "We'll be out all day. Don't worry about dinner." I poured my coffee into a chipped mug and carried it to the back door. Outside, the roses drooped under their own weight. I trimmed them anyway, careful with the shears, the way Frank used to remind me to take my time. When I came back in, Tracy's voice echoed from the living room. She had returned early, talking loudly on her phone. I told her, "My mother-in-law's place is perfect. Classic bones. Just needs a little polish." She caught my reflection in the mirror and smiled like nothing had happened. "Oh, Maggie. Sorry. Just talking shop." You don't mind if I take some pictures for inspiration? Do you? Pictures of what I asked? Even though I already knew. The layout, she said, waving her phone. Daniel thinks if we ever sell, we should list how much natural light the living room gets. Sell. The word hung between us like smoke. I forced a laugh. You two planning to move again? She blinked once. Too long. Then said. Just an idea. Daniel's always planning ahead. I watched her leave the room and touch everything she passed. Her fingers tracing the edges of my life. Later that afternoon, Marilyn called down the stairs. Her voice syrupy sweet. Margaret. Do you have any extra dish towels? The ones upstairs are stained. I found 2 folded ones and carried them up. Marilyn took them, looked at the pattern, and sighed. You really love these old-fashioned prints. Don't you? My mother had the same taste. Simple. Her tone made the word sound like small. Daniel came home after dark. I was sewing a button back on his shirt when he walked down the basement stairs without knocking. Hey. Mom, he said, glancing around. You've really made this space cozy. Maybe we can fix it up a little more for you. Make it feel separate. Separate from what I asked. He smiled but didn't answer. I got you a new lock for the basement door, he added, so you can have privacy. Tracy worries about safety. When he left, I looked at the door. The word privacy felt like exile. The next morning, I heard them arguing upstairs. Tracy said something about credit cards. Daniel told her to calm down. The sound of drawers opening and closing made my stomach twist. I climbed halfway up the stairs and listened. Tracy's voice carried. You can't just cut her off without saying anything. She never checks her accounts. Daniel said, it'll make things simpler if I consolidate them. She doesn't need 3 cards. I stepped back down slowly, one hand gripping the railing. Later that day, I checked my wallet. One of my cards was missing. That evening, I found Tracy sitting in Frank's chair with her feet on the ottoman. She was drinking from my glass of Merlot. You don't mind if I sit here? Do you? She asked. I smiled thinly. He used to sit there every night. Oh, I know, she said. Not moving. Daniel told me. He said you two built this house together. That's amazing. Not a lot of women from your generation did that. I wanted to tell her that every inch of this place carried the print of my hands. Instead, I said, yes, we built it. And I paid off the mortgage myself after he died. Tracy tilted her head. Wow. Then you must be really proud to share it with family now. Proud. That was one word for it. Later that night, I walked upstairs quietly and opened the door to the guest room. My jewelry box was on the dresser. Open. The velvet tray half empty. I stared at it for a long time before closing the lid. I wanted to shout. But something inside me said, wait. 2 days later, I went to the grocery store. When I tried to pay, the cashier said my card was declined. I laughed it off and handed her another one. Declined again. I used cash and drove home shaking. When I opened my laptop to check my account, the password had been changed. I called Daniel. He didn't pick up. 30 minutes later, he texted, all good. I'm handling finances for now. We'll reimburse you if you need anything. We. Not I. I went down to the basement and sat at my sewing table. The hum of the dryer was steady. Calming. I took out an old ledger I had kept for years. The one where I used to track every sale from my shop. I flipped to a blank page and started writing down what was missing my card. My jewelry. My passwords. When I reached for my pen the second time, I realized my checkbook was gone too. That night, I dreamed I was in the kitchen again, baking bread while Daniel did homework at the table. Frank came in, kissed my cheek, said he liked the smell of home. When I woke up, my hands were clenched tight around the quilt. The next afternoon, Tracy and Marilyn had friends over for coffee. Their laughter floated through the vents. The words drifting down like dust. She forgets everything. Tracy said, "Yesterday, she left the stove on. That's dangerous." Someone replied, "I know." Tracy said, "We'll have to talk to a lawyer soon." Just in case. A lawyer. My heart pounded so hard, I had to sit down. They were setting the stage. Make me seem forgetful. Unstable. I wasn't losing my mind. They wanted my house. That evening, Daniel came downstairs again. "Mom, can we talk?" I nodded, folding my hands. He said he was worried about me. He said Tracy had noticed some confusion. He said it might be smart to have a plan. Maybe set up a power of attorney. Just for convenience. I stared at him until the words stopped making sense. Then I said, "Do you remember who taught you to balance a checkbook?" "Daniel, who sat beside you until you stopped mixing up the columns." He rubbed his face. "Mom, this isn't about the past. It's all the past." "Honey," I said softly, "everything you're touching right now used to be mine." He sighed and stood. "I'm trying to help you. Please don't make this hard." When he left, I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. The hum of the dryer had stopped. Above me, the floor creaked. Footsteps moving from one room to another. I could picture them walking over my head, carrying plans and whispered conversations. I pressed my palm against the cool wall. I would not cry again. I would not beg to keep what I had built. I would find out exactly what they were doing. And I would wait until the truth came to me. Upstairs, someone laughed. The sound bled through the vents like wind through a crack. I closed my eyes and listened until the quiet returned. Morning came wrapped in a dull gray light that made everything in the basement look like an old photograph. I sat at the sewing table with a cold cup of coffee, staring at the list I had written the night before. Missing jewelry. Cancelled cards. Passwords changed. Conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Each line felt heavier than the last. I didn't know how deep their plan went. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't sit here waiting to disappear from my own life. When I climbed the stairs, the smell of cinnamon rolls hit me. Tracy stood by the oven wearing one of my aprons. The one Frank bought me the year we opened the shop. Marilyn was at the counter, scrolling on her phone. And Daniel sat at the table with a stack of mail. "Good morning," I said. Marilyn looked up. "Oh, Margaret. You startled me. I didn't hear you come up." "I live here," I said quietly. Daniel pushed the stack of envelopes aside. "Mom, I was going through some of your mail. You've been missing a few payments. Nothing serious yet. But we should get things organized. I pay my bills on time," I replied. He gave me a patient smile. "You used to. But there's been some confusion lately. Tracy and I can take care of it." I wanted to ask what confusion he meant. But Tracy turned from the oven with a bright smile. "We'll handle it. Maggie, you don't need to stress about numbers anymore. Numbers. The same numbers that had built my business, my house, my future." I walked over to the table, picked up one of the envelopes, and saw it had already been opened. Inside was a notice from my bank. Account access changed. New authorized user Daniel Cooper. I folded the paper slowly and slipped it into my pocket. That afternoon, when they left to run errands, I went to my old office at the end of the hall. It was Linda's now. Or rather Marilyn's. With her crystals and motivational posters everywhere. My file cabinet sat pushed against the wall, half open. I knelt beside it and began checking the folders. Some were missing. Tax records, deeds, insurance papers. My name had been peeled off one drawer and replaced with a sticky note that read, "Storage." I felt the familiar pulse of anger rise in my chest. The kind that doesn't make you shout, just sharpens your focus. I opened the bottom drawer, found my old leather portfolio, and flipped it open. Inside were copies of my property deed, my will, and my business closure papers. I had kept them in case of emergencies. I slid them into my bag and whispered, "Not today." When I came back downstairs, I noticed something strange. The lamp near my bed was unplugged. My phone, which I kept charging there, had been moved. I checked the call log. One number stood out. A law firm in town. I recognized the name from the conversation Tracy had with her friends. I sat on the edge of the bed, the realization sinking in. They weren't just talking about controlling my money. They were trying to take legal control of me. The next morning I called Susan, my oldest friend. We hadn't spoken in months. I told her I needed to meet somewhere quiet. We met at a small cafe near the river. The same place where we used to celebrate birthdays when Frank was still alive. She took one look at me and frowned. "You look pale." "Maggie. What's going on?" I told her everything. Not all at once, but in pieces, like pulling threads from a tangled skein. About Daniel moving them in. About the cards. The missing jewelry. The whispers about lawyers. Susan's face went red. "That's theft. Margaret. Fraud. You should call the police." "I can't," I said. "Not yet. They'll twist it. They've been setting me up, making me look forgetful. Then you need proof," she said firmly. "Something they can't deny." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Proof. That night, I waited until the house was dark. I moved quietly up the basement stairs, barefoot, the boards creaking under my weight. In the living room, the glow of Tracy's phone charger lit the table. My jewelry box sat nearby. I opened it and found my grandmother's ring tucked inside the lining, where someone had hidden it. I slipped it on my finger and turned toward the hallway. From upstairs came the faint sound of voices. Daniel and Tracy, half asleep, talking low. "She's stubborn," Tracy said. "If we wait too long, she might change the accounts again." "She can't," Daniel answered. "Everything's under my control now. Once the lawyer files the papers, she won't have a say." My chest felt tight. Papers. It was real. I tiptoed back to the basement and sat in the dark until morning. My hands shook. Not from fear, but from resolve. I needed someone who understood the law. Someone I could trust. 2 days later, I drove to town, pretending to shop for groceries. Instead, I parked in front of a small law office whose sign read Keller and Westbrook Attorneys. I remembered that Olivia Westbrook, the junior partner, had been one of my customers years ago when I still ran the shop. She had always been kind. When I walked in, she looked up from her desk and smiled. "Mrs. Cooper, it's been ages. I need your help," I said quietly. We sat in her office for nearly an hour while I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, taking notes, her brow furrowing more with each detail. "Margaret," she said finally, "what they're doing sounds like financial manipulation. And if they're preparing a conservatorship claim, they need to prove you're incompetent. That's a serious accusation." "Can they win?" She leaned back. "Not if we're prepared. You need medical evaluations showing you're of sound mind. Get them from independent specialists, not anyone they know. And keep records of every strange thing that happens. Dates, conversations, missing items." I nodded, feeling both terrified and relieved. Someone believed me. Before I left, she handed me a card. "If they try anything legal before you're ready, call me immediately. And don't confront them yet. Let them think you're harmless." That last sentence rang in my ears all the way home. Let them think you're harmless. When I walked in, Daniel was in the kitchen with a stack of papers spread across the counter. He smiled, like nothing was wrong. "Mom, I found some forms that might make things easier. Just simple authorizations. So I can help with your taxes." I looked at the papers. Durable power of attorney. I met his eyes and smiled. Of course. Honey. Leave them here. And I'll look them over tomorrow. He seemed relieved. Thanks. Mom. You'll see. It'll just simplify everything. That night, I locked my door for the first time since moving downstairs. I took out my notebook and wrote down every word he had said. Then I folded the page and tucked it under my pillow. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept circling around Olivia's advice. Stay calm. Gather proof. Let them think they're winning. By dawn, I had a plan. It wasn't complete yet. But it was something. I would get those evaluations. Quietly. I would document every lie. Every missing dollar. Every whispered conversation. When the morning sun finally slipped through the small basement window, I took my first deep breath in days. Upstairs. The house began to stir. Footsteps. Water running. A baby crying. The sound of their world waking up. I poured myself a cup of coffee. Steady now. And whispered. Let's see who underestimates who. The morning air was sharp and clean when I stepped outside. The kind of air that wakes you up better than coffee. I stood by the mailbox, pretending to admire the maple trees lining the street while my heart raced. Daniel's car wasn't in the driveway. Tracy's. Either. It was my window of freedom. I slid into my old Buick, turned the key, and whispered a small prayer that it would start quietly. It did. The drive to Dr. R. Lang's office was only 15 minutes. But I kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if someone might be following me. Olivia had arranged the appointment, saying Dr. Lang was a respected neurologist who understood cases like mine. His office sat on the second floor of a medical complex with bright posters about memory health and balance therapy. When I walked in, the receptionist smiled. Mrs. Cooper. Dr. Lang will see you soon. Inside his office, sunlight streamed through half-open blinds, cutting the room into stripes. Dr. Lang looked like a man who had been listening to other people's problems for a long time. Kind eyes but sharp behind the glasses. He asked me about my daily routine, my work history, what year it was, who the president was. The usual things. I answered every question clearly. Though my voice shook when I described what had been happening at home, he took notes in looping handwriting. After a short pause, he said, "You're remarkably sharp. Mrs. Cooper, I'll send you the full cognitive assessment results. But I see no indication of memory loss or confusion." I exhaled so hard, I almost laughed. "Thank you," I said. "You have no idea what that means." When I left, I felt lighter, like I had a weapon, even if it was only paper for now. I drove straight to Olivia's office and handed her the report. She smiled when she read the summary. "That's one," she said. "We'll get 2 more evaluations for backup. If they try to file a conservatorship, this will end it before it starts." "Will they know?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not if you keep playing along. Let them think they're winning." That afternoon, I drove home feeling almost steady again. But the moment I opened the front door, I knew something was off. Tracy was standing by the kitchen island, arms crossed. Daniel sat at the table, a manila folder in front of him. Marilyn hovered nearby with a mug of tea. Daniel's tone was too calm. "Where were you?" "Mom, you didn't say you were going anywhere." I set my purse down carefully. "I went out for a drive. Needed some air." Tracy's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You should have told us. We were worried. It's not safe for you to wander off like that." "Wander off? Like a lost dog?" "I wasn't wandering," I said. "I'm allowed to leave my house." Daniel sighed. "That's not what we meant. It's just, you've been distracted lately. You left the front door unlocked this morning." "No," I said, my voice cold. "I locked it. He looked at me with that same pitying expression I used to give him when he lied about doing his homework. Maybe you thought you did. Don't worry. I took care of it. I wanted to scream. But Olivia's words echoed in my head. Stay calm. Let them think you're harmless. I smiled faintly. Good. I wouldn't want anything to happen to my things. Daniel flinched at that. Tracy looked away. That evening, I sat on the edge of my basement bed with my notebook open, writing every detail. The way Daniel had spoken, the tone in Tracy's voice, the folder on the table. Proof. I reminded myself. Everything is proof. The next few days blurred together. I pretended to forget small things. I let them think they were in control. Daniel started leaving notes on the fridge, reminding me to take my vitamins. Tracy began checking my mail before I could reach it. Marilyn even started walking around with my spare house keys on her ring. But I wasn't helpless. I was watching. One afternoon, while they were out shopping, I searched the office again. On the desk sat a document with my name, typed neatly at the top. Petition for temporary conservatorship. My throat tightened as I skimmed the lines. Subject exhibits cognitive decline. Unsafe to manage finances. Requires supervision. My son's signature sat at the bottom. For a long time, I just stood there staring. The paper trembled in my hand. He had already filed it. I took a picture of it with my phone and sent it to Olivia. Within minutes, she called back. We can stop this. Margaret, we'll file a counterpetition with your medical reports. But you need to keep acting the same way. If they think you know, they'll accelerate it. I understand, I said. But it's hard pretending I don't. I know, she said gently. But the longer they believe they're ahead, the more they'll expose themselves. That night, I made dinner for everyone. A roast with potatoes and carrots like I used to make when Daniel was a boy. They all seemed surprised but pleased. Tracy poured wine. Marilyn chatted about a neighbor's new car. Daniel told a story about his job. It almost felt normal until I caught Tracy watching me too closely, waiting for me to slip up. I smiled and asked Daniel if he remembered the first time he tried to help me in the kitchen. How he dropped the whole bowl of mashed potatoes on the floor. He laughed. Genuinely. For a brief moment, I saw my son again. Not the stranger, plotting behind my back. But the moment passed when Tracy said, maybe you should write these stories down, Maggie. That way, if you ever forget, you'll still have them. The table went silent. Daniel shot her a warning look. But she just shrugged. I set down my fork and smiled sweetly. That's a lovely idea, Tracy. I think I will. Maybe I'll even record a few things. Just in case. She blinked, realizing too late what I'd implied. After dinner, I went to my room and began setting up my phone discreetly behind a small stack of books near the stairs. If they were going to talk freely about their plans, I'd be ready. 2 days later, the recorder caught exactly what I needed. I listened to it that night through headphones. Sitting in the dark, Tracy's voice came first. Once the court date's set, we'll move her to a facility. Daniel, you'll have full access by then. Daniel's reply was quieter. I don't want to put her away. I just want to make sure she doesn't ruin things. She won't even remember, Tracy said. She'll thank us later. I sat there trembling. Not from fear, but from the cold clarity of knowing I was right. I copied the file to a hidden flash drive, labeled it with the date, and tucked it into the hem of my old sewing bag. The next morning, Daniel came down to tell me the hearing would be in 2 weeks. He said it softly, as if he were comforting a child. I nodded, pretending to misunderstand, and asked if he wanted me to bake cookies for the occasion. He smiled, relieved, completely fooled. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight sliding through the narrow basement window. It painted a thin gold line across the floor, a reminder that even underground, Light finds a way in, I whispered to the quiet room. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The next few days felt like standing on thin ice. Hearing every small crack beneath me, but pretending I didn't. I went about my routine. Folding laundry. Watering the plants outside. Smiling at Tracy when she asked if I remembered to take my vitamins. Inside. I was counting hours. 2 weeks until the hearing. 2 weeks until they thought they would own me. Every night. I listened to the recording again, not because I needed to, but because it reminded me that I wasn't crazy. Their voices were clear. Confident. Greedy. The flash drive was my anchor. One evening, I sat by the basement window, watching the faint reflection of the house lights ripple across the glass. That was when I heard a knock at the back door. It startled me because nobody ever knocked anymore. I climbed the stairs, careful not to make noise, and opened the door, just a crack. It was William Harper. I hadn't seen him in almost a year. He used to come by the shop before I closed it. A retired judge with an easy smile and a fondness for old-fashioned suits. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes were still sharp. Maggie, he said softly. I was walking by and saw your car out front. Thought I'd check on you. I stepped aside to let him in. You shouldn't have come, I said, though my voice betrayed how much I needed to see a friendly face. He sat at the kitchen table while I poured tea. The sound of the kettle calmed me more than I expected. He looked around. Your place looks different. That's one word for it. I handed him a cup and sat across from him. They've rearranged everything, including me. He frowned. Daniel, yes. He filed for conservatorship. I told him everything, leaving out nothing this time. When I finished, he set his cup down slowly, the way someone might handle a loaded gun. Maggie, he said, this isn't just cruel. It's illegal if he's manipulating the courts. Do you have representation? I do, I said. A lawyer named Olivia Westbrook. She's sharp. He nodded approvingly. I know her. Good choice. But if you want to win, you'll need evidence beyond the recording. Courts don't always take emotion seriously. I have medical reports, I said. 3. All clear. He smiled faintly. Then you have a chance. But you'll need one more thing. Proof that the house is legally yours. Not just sentimentally. That caught my attention. I have the deed, I said. It's in my name. Always has been. He leaned forward. Then keep it safe. Do not let anyone touch it. They might claim you transferred ownership. It happens more than you'd think. His words sent a chill through me. After he left, I went straight to the basement and pulled out my file box. The deed was still there, folded inside a clear sleeve, stamped with a county seal. My name in bold letters. I ran my fingers across the ink as if touching it could make me stronger. That night, as I sat in bed, I heard faint movement upstairs. Doors opening. Drawers sliding. I turned off the lamp and waited. My heart thudded in my chest, steady as a drum. After a while, Daniel's footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. He paused there, breathing quietly. Then the door handle turned. Locked. He jiggled it once, maybe to test if I was awake, then walked away. The next morning, Tracy was unusually cheerful. She made pancakes and asked if I wanted some. I said yes. She seemed disappointed. Later, I found Daniel in the kitchen, hunched over his laptop. Need something, he asked without looking up. I was going to clean the front porch. I said, do you know where you put the spare key for the storage cabinet? He looked up then, eyes narrowing. I didn't touch it. Oh, I said, smiling lightly. Must have been the cleaning fairy. He studied me for a moment before shaking his head. Mom, you've got to stop being suspicious all the time. We're just trying to help you. I know, I said, keeping my tone steady. You've been very helpful. That evening, Olivia called. Her voice was crisp. I filed the motion to delay their petition. It buys us time. But we might have a bigger problem. What kind of problem? I checked the county database. Someone attempted to request a copy of your deed last week using your address and social security number. My stomach dropped. Who? They listed Daniel Cooper as the authorized party. I sat very still. Can he do that? Not legally. But he might have enough of your information to fake consent. If that deed disappears, your position weakens. I'd suggest moving the original somewhere they can't find it. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the room, gripping the phone like it could keep me upright. I thought about William's warning. I thought about Daniel trying the basement door. I knew what I had to do. At midnight, I put on a coat and crept upstairs. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I slipped the deed into an envelope, tucked it inside my purse, and left through the back door. The air was cold and smelled of rain. I drove to William's house a few blocks away. The lights were out, but I could see his living room lamp faintly glowing behind the curtains. When he opened the door, he looked surprised but not alarmed. Sorry to wake you, I said, holding out the envelope. I need you to keep this. He took it gently. You trust me that much. I trust you more than I trust anyone else right now. He nodded, his face grave. Then I'll lock it in my safe. You'll get it back when this is over. Thank you, I said. That paper is the only thing standing between me and nothing. Driving home, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway, turned off the headlights early, and slipped inside quietly. The next morning, Daniel knocked on the basement door. Mom, did you go out last night? I looked him straight in the eye. No. Why? He frowned. I thought I heard the car. Maybe you dreamed it, I said. You've been under a lot of stress. He stared at me a moment longer, then walked away. I waited until his footsteps faded before letting out a slow breath. The day dragged on quietly after that. Tracy busied herself upstairs. Marilyn watched television. Daniel took calls in the living room. I stayed in the basement, sewing patches onto an old quilt, pretending my hands weren't trembling. That night, I sat by the window again, the little one near the ceiling. The faint orange glow of the streetlights spilled through. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel trapped. The walls around me still smelled of dust and detergent. But somewhere inside the fear, there was a small spark of control. I thought about Frank. About how he used to say, patience wins more battles than rage ever will. I finally understood what he meant. Upstairs, footsteps crossed the floor again. Daniel's voice. Then Tracy's. Their words were muffled, but I caught one phrase clearly. She'll never see it coming. I smiled to myself in the dark. Neither will they. The morning after that conversation, I moved slower than usual, letting them think I was tired. The more they underestimated me, the safer I was. I could feel Daniel's eyes following me as I shuffled through the kitchen, pretending to forget where I'd put the sugar. He sighed the way sons sigh when they think their mothers are losing touch with reality. I smiled to myself. Let him think that. Tracy breezed in wearing her robe and a cloud of perfume. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. We should start sorting through some of Mom's old files, she said to Daniel. For the court. It'll show how unorganized everything's gotten. It'll help our case. She said it so casually, like she was talking about cleaning the attic. I opened the fridge and pretended not to hear. Daniel glanced at me, then at her. We'll handle that later, he said quietly, but not quietly enough. After breakfast, I went back downstairs and sat at the sewing table. My fingers itched for something to do, so I took out an old cardigan and started patching a tear that wasn't even there. It wasn't about sewing. It was about keeping my hands steady while my mind worked. I needed more than the recording and the medical reports. I needed physical proof of their intent. Something undeniable. Around noon, when Tracy went out to meet clients and Marilyn took the baby for a walk, I slipped upstairs. The living room smelled like fresh lemon polish. Fake and clean. I went to the office, opened the drawer where Daniel kept his paperwork, and scanned the folders. Among the utility bills and tax forms was one labeled Property. Inside were photocopies of my deed, bank letters, and a draft document with my signature, except it wasn't mine. I studied it closely. The curve of the M was wrong. The spacing between letters off. I'd spent half my life signing purchase orders and checks. I knew my own handwriting, like I knew the sound of my voice. My son had forged my name. I took a quick photo of the document with my phone, then slipped it back exactly as I'd found it. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might echo through the walls. When I turned to leave, I heard the front door open. Daniel's voice floated down the hallway. "Mom, you up here?" I froze. My hands started to sweat. I stepped into the hallway, smiling as naturally as I could. "Just looking for the duster," I said. "The shelves in the basement are covered in lint." He frowned. "You don't need to worry about that. I'll take care of the cleaning later. I like keeping busy," I said. "Helps me remember what day it is." He studied me for a moment, his eyes softening with what he probably thought was pity. "All right," he said finally. "Just don't tire yourself out." When he walked away, I exhaled slowly and counted to 10 before moving. Every nerve in my body felt like a wire pulled too tight. That evening, I called Olivia from the basement, my voice barely above a whisper. "He forged my signature," I said. "I found the papers." "Did you take them?" "No. Just photos. If I move anything, he'll notice." "That's fine," she said. "I'll have my investigator cross-check the file numbers in the county system. If he's submitted anything under your name, we'll find it." "Olivia," I said, my voice cracking a little. "I don't even recognize my son anymore." There was a pause on the line before she answered. "You will, when he's sitting in front of a judge explaining himself." The next few days, I kept my routine predictable. I made tea at the same time every morning, watched the news, and asked simple questions like where the remote was. It wasn't acting anymore. It was camouflage. Tracy seemed pleased with my passivity. She started asking me to do small things: fold their laundry, take the trash out, pick up packages. "You don't mind?" "Right," she'd say, with that bright tone that barely hid the command beneath. I didn't mind. Every trip upstairs gave me a chance to observe, to listen. I noticed they started locking the office drawer. That told me they were getting nervous. One night, around 11, I heard their voices again. I moved quietly to the bottom of the stairs, pressing my ear against the wall near the vent. Tracy was whispering. "If we can get her to sign that revised transfer, the lawyer said it'll go smoother. We just need her hand on paper once. She's suspicious." Daniel replied. "Every time I mention anything financial, she shuts down. Then catch her off guard." Tracy said, "Bring up something sentimental. Maybe tell her it's paperwork for a charity donation. She trusts you more than me." My throat tightened. I gripped the railing until my knuckles ached. The next morning, Daniel came downstairs with a gentle smile and 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, Mom," he said, handing one to me. "I was thinking about Dad today. Remember how he always donated to that veterans group? I'm filling out a form in his name. Want to sign with me? I thought it might make you feel close to him again." I stared at the papers in his hand. The top page looked official, printed with a logo, but the bottom ones were hidden under it. I didn't reach for the pen. "That's kind of you," I said softly. "But I'm not feeling well. Maybe later." He frowned slightly, then covered it with a smile. "Sure. No rush." After he left, I went upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. I pulled out my phone and texted Olivia. They're going to try to trick me into signing. What should I do? Her reply came fast. Let them try. Record it. It'll be evidence of coercion. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My hair had gone gray years ago. But now, I saw something new in my face, not weakness, but focus. I looked like someone who was waiting for her moment. That afternoon, Susan stopped by unannounced. Daniel wasn't home, and Tracy was upstairs on a call. When I opened the door, Susan's eyes widened. You look tired, she said, stepping in. Are they still giving you trouble? I nodded and handed her the flash drive. Everything's on there. If something happens to me, you give it to Olivia. Maggie, she whispered, clutching it. Don't talk like that. I'm fine, I said, just being careful. We talked for a while about the old days, the shop, Frank, our trips to the lake. It was the first normal conversation I'd had in months. Before she left, she squeezed my hand. They don't know who they're dealing with. After she left, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the street. The house was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator upstairs. Then I heard the basement door creak open. Daniel's voice floated down. Mom. Who was that? A friend, I said, just dropping off something. He paused for a long moment before saying, I don't want strangers coming around. It's confusing for you. Confusing. That word again. I bit back the anger rising in my chest. She's not a stranger, I said. She's known me longer than you've been alive. He muttered something under his breath and shut the door. I sat back on the bed, the faint tremor in my hands finally stilling. Every insult, every lie, every whispered scheme, they were all adding up. The trap they thought they were building for me was starting to close around them instead. Upstairs, I heard the faint sound of Tracy laughing on the phone. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the path of her footsteps as she crossed the floor. Each step echoed like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. The night stretched long and thin, every sound in the house carrying twice its weight. I lay awake on the narrow bed, counting each creak in the floor above. Tracy's heels clicked once, then silence, then the soft hum of Daniel's voice through the vent. I caught fragments. Not enough for words, just tone, urgent, low, cautious. My chest felt tight with the knowing that something was about to happen. Morning came gray and cool. I made coffee and sat by the basement window, pretending to read while I listened for clues in the rhythm of the day. At 8, Daniel's phone rang. His voice sharpened as he answered. Yes. Friday works. The buyer's ready to move fast. Buyer. My pulse stumbled. I froze. Mug halfway to my mouth. I waited until the conversation ended, then wrote the word down in my notebook and circled it twice. Buyer. They weren't just planning to take my house. They were ready to sell it. By noon, they were both out. I climbed upstairs and searched carefully. On the kitchen counter sat a printed email thread. Tracy had left her laptop open, the screen half asleep. I tapped the space bar. The subject line read, 2,211 watts. Deming property, offer accepted. I clicked. My name was nowhere on the correspondence, but Daniel's was. He'd signed as owner. The buyer's agent had attached a contract with a closing date only 3 days away. There it was, in black and white, the house I built, the one I had paid for with every hour of my life, listed like an asset to be traded. I took photos of the screen, every attachment, every signature. Then I shut it down and stepped back, breathing slowly. The walls of the kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. I walked out onto the porch, pretending to admire the hydrangeas while my knees trembled. I called Olivia as soon as I was out of sight of the house. They're selling it, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Friday. It's already in contract. Her tone sharpened. You're sure I have the proof? It's on Tracy's laptop. Daniel signed as the owner. Don't confront them, she said. Send me the pictures. All of them. I'll contact the county recorder and the title company. If they've tried to record a false deed, we can block it. But we'll need to move fast. Fast is all I have, I said. I sent her everything. Then waited. The minutes dragged like hours. Finally, her text came through. We're on it. Keep quiet. Don't change your routine. I spent the rest of the day in the basement, pretending to mend an old blanket. Needle trembling in my hand. When Daniel came down that night, he was all smiles. Hey, Mom. You'll be glad to know the roof repairs I mentioned are finally happening. Friday morning. Some people will come by to look around. Roof repairs, I repeated. Yeah, he said lightly. Nothing big. Just an inspection. I smiled faintly. That's nice of you to handle. He hesitated, maybe expecting a question. When none came, he nodded and left. The moment the door closed, I turned off the lamp and whispered to the quiet air. You picked the wrong woman to lie to. The next morning, Olivia called again. The recorder flagged the transfer request. The deed in their system still shows your name, Margaret. But someone filed a pending release form using your signature. We stopped it before it was recorded. So they were going to fake it. Yes, she said. And it's worse. The title company scheduled a closing for Friday at 10. I talked to their office. They think Daniel Cooper owns the property. We'll need to be there. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. There, yes. I'll be there in person. Don't tell him you know. We'll let him walk into it thinking he's already won. The next day passed in a strange stillness. Daniel barely spoke to me. Tracy hummed as she folded clothes. Cheerful, in that fake way she got when she was hiding something. I moved through the motions of a normal day. Cooking soup. Sweeping the porch. Smiling when spoken to. Inside, I was rehearsing every word I'd need for Friday. That night, I packed a small envelope. Inside it, I placed my deed, the copy William had kept for me, and the printout of my cognitive assessment. Stamped and signed. I added the photo of Daniel's forged signature and the flash drive of their recorded conversation. I tucked the envelope into my handbag and slept with it under my pillow. At dawn on Friday, I woke early and made breakfast like any other day. Pancakes. Bacon. Coffee. Daniel came down in a pressed shirt. Hair slicked back. The look of a man about to close a deal. He kissed my forehead, like he was doing me a favor. Big day, I asked. He smiled. Just work. Mom. Don't wait up for me. Tracy followed him out, whispering something I couldn't catch. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled the breath I'd been holding. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Joyiwu. At 9:30. Olivia texted, I'm here. Title office on Lincoln Ave. Wait, 15 minutes. Then come. I grabbed my purse, locked the basement door behind me, and stepped into the bright Chicago morning. The air smelled like rain and new beginnings. I drove slowly, hands steady on the wheel. When I arrived, Olivia was already inside, her briefcase open on the table. Across from her sat a young man in a suit, the buyer's agent. Daniel and Tracy were there too. They looked up, startled. When I walked in, Mom, Daniel said, forcing a laugh. What are you doing here? I set my bag down calmly. I heard there were roof repairs. I figured I'd sign the papers myself. The agent frowned, confused. Mrs. Cooper, are you the current owner? Yes, I said. As a matter of fact, I am. Daniel's smile faltered. Mom, you must be mistaken. We already transferred the title. Remember the paperwork last month? I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. You mean the paperwork with my forged signature, the one filed with a false notary? The agent's eyes widened. Olivia slid the photos across the table. This is a copy of the real deed. And this, she tapped, Daniel's version is a forgery. My client never authorized any sale. Tracy's face went pale. You can't prove that. Olivia smiled. We can. And we did. The recorder's office confirmed the fraud this morning. The police are already aware. Daniel stood, his voice shaking. Mom, I was trying to protect you. You don't understand how hard this has been. I looked at him, my own son, and felt something inside me break and then settle into place. You were trying to protect yourself. Daniel, don't pretend this was love. The agent closed his folder quietly and muttered an apology before leaving. Tracy followed him out without looking back. Daniel stayed frozen, hands clenched at his sides. Olivia gathered the documents. We'll file an injunction to prevent further activity. You're safe now. Safe. The word felt foreign. When we stepped outside, the wind caught my hair, cool and clean. Olivia asked if I wanted a ride home. But I shook my head. I'll walk, I said. I want to remember how it feels to move on my own. The city felt different that day. The noise softer. The colors brighter. I walked 3 blocks before stopping at a small bench beneath a maple tree. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe deeply. It wasn't over yet. But for the first time, it wasn't them who held the next move. It was me. By the time I reached home, the sun was sinking low behind the trees, painting the street in shades of gold and rust. The house looked the same from the outside, quiet and polite. The kind of house that never tells on what goes on inside it. I stood there for a long moment, hand on the gate, wondering how something so still could hold so much noise. When I stepped inside, the air felt heavier. Daniel's car wasn't in the driveway. Tracy's wasn't either. I walked through the kitchen, into the living room, and looked around. The room that once held music, dinners, laughter, now felt stripped of sound. I sat in Frank's chair and let the quiet settle. Olivia had promised the papers would be filed by the end of the day. Fraud report, protective order, notification to the title company. Everything official. Everything in writing. For the first time in months, the law was on my side. I didn't know how long I sat there before I heard the front door open. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Daniel's voice came from the hallway. Mom, we need to talk. I turned slightly but didn't stand. All right. Talk. He stepped into the living room. Eyes dark. Tired. He looked older than he had that morning. Like the truth had aged him in a few hours. You blindsided me today. You humiliated me in front of people I work with. You humiliated yourself, I said calmly. All I did was show up. He ran a hand through his hair. You don't understand what this looks like now. They're saying I committed fraud. Mom, fraud. I could lose my license. You almost cost me my home. I was trying to manage things. He said. You're not as sharp as you used to be. You forget things. You leave the stove on. I never left the stove on. I said quietly. You just told people I did. He stared at me. Mouth open. No words coming out. Then he sat down across from me. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Yes. You did. I looked at him fully then. You just didn't expect me to fight back. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You've always been dramatic. You don't need a house this size. You could live somewhere smaller, somewhere safe. I was trying to take care of you. I let out a small laugh. By stealing from me, I was fixing what you wouldn't face. He said sharply. You hold on to everything like it's the past that keeps you breathing. This house. Dad's things. Your stupid sewing room. You can't take them with you. Mom. You'll die surrounded by old fabric and dust. His words hit me like cold water. But I didn't flinch. Maybe, I said. But at least I'll die with my name still mine. He stood. Pacing now. Voice rising. You're so stubborn. You always were. You think you're smarter than everyone. Even me. I don't think that, I said. I just stopped pretending you were. He stopped pacing. Hands clenched at his sides. You really think I'm the villain here? I looked up at him. The boy I'd once rocked to sleep. The man I no longer recognized. I think you stopped being my son the moment you decided I was a burden. He flinched like I'd hit him. For a second, his eyes softened. Then hardened again. You'll regret this, he said finally. You always do. He walked out without slamming the door. Which somehow felt worse. That night, the house was too quiet again. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every shadow on the wall looked like someone standing just out of sight. Around midnight. I went upstairs to check the locks. The door was bolted. The windows closed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. At dawn, Olivia called. They'll issue the protective order this morning, she said. He won't be able to sell, transfer, or even claim management rights. You're in the clear legally. I wanted to say thank you. But my throat closed up. He's angry. I managed. He came here last night. Do you feel safe? Yes. I lied. After we hung up, I went outside to the garden. The air was cool, damp with dew. The roses had overgrown the fence. Wild and stubborn. I trimmed one of the branches and thought of Frank. How he used to tell me a garden was just proof that life keeps trying. By the time I went back inside, Daniel's car was parked out front again. My stomach sank. I hadn't even heard it pull in. He was standing in the living room, papers in hand. Mom, he said, his voice too calm. We can still fix this. There's nothing to fix, I said. It's done. He held up a set of documents. You can make it go away. Just sign these and withdraw your complaint. We'll say it was a misunderstanding. I looked at the papers. They were blank at the bottom. Space for a signature. You're still trying, I said. After everything, he took a step closer. I could lose everything. Mom, my career, my reputation. Please. I shook my head. You already lost what mattered most. He stared at me for a long moment, then tore the papers in half and dropped them on the floor. Fine, he said quietly. You win. He left again. And this time, I locked the door behind him. That evening, Olivia stopped by in person. She looked tired but relieved. The county confirmed the fraud report. The buyer backed out completely. And the district attorney's office is reviewing the case. What happens now, I asked. They might charge him, she said. Or they might just revoke his license and fine him. Either way, he can't touch your property again. I nodded. Though part of me ached at the thought of my own son facing charges, Olivia hesitated, then said softly, I've seen families tear each other apart over less. You did the right thing. After she left, I sat by the window and watched the street grow dark. The wind picked up, rattling the old maple branches against the siding. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. The house was mine again. My name, my space, my silence. I went downstairs to the basement, the place they'd sent me to disappear. The lamp still sat on the shelf, the quilt still folded on the bed. I ran my hand along the wall and felt the coolness of the concrete. It didn't feel like exile anymore. It felt like proof. Upstairs, the phone rang once, then stopped. The house held its breath. I stood there in the half-light, listening to the sound of nothing, and let the quiet settle inside me like peace. Morning light stretched across the kitchen floor in soft stripes, touching the edge of the table where a cup of tea sat untouched. The house was still. No footsteps. No voices. No hum of the refrigerator door opening and closing every few minutes. I stood in the middle of the room, hands resting on the counter, listening to the silence like it was something new. Olivia had said the hearing was just a formality now. A final step before the court officially returned full control to me. She promised it would be over soon. But even with the law on my side, my chest still carried a weight I couldn't shake. Winning didn't feel like victory yet. I spent the early morning cleaning. I polished the silver tray Frank used to serve Sunday breakfast, dusted the piano no one had played in years, and opened the windows wide. The air outside smelled of rain and lilac. For the first time in months, the scent drifted through every room without permission. Around 9, a knock came at the door. When I opened it, a uniformed officer stood beside Olivia. His presence startled me at first, but Olivia's calm face steadied me. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper," the officer said. "We're here to deliver the formal eviction notice to your son." I stepped back to let them in. My heart thudded low and steady. Daniel's car was in the driveway. He hadn't left yet. They waited in the living room while I called upstairs. "Daniel, could you come down a moment?" He appeared at the top of the stairs in jeans and a wrinkled shirt, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. When he saw the officer, his expression faltered. "What's going on?" Olivia spoke first. "The court has finalized its decision. This officer is here to serve the notice. You and your family have 30 days to vacate the property." Daniel stared at her, then at me. "You called the cops on your own son." I didn't answer right away. I picked up the envelope from the table and handed it to him. "You called them on yourself when you filed those fake documents." He tore the seal open, scanning the papers, jaw tightening with every line. "You can't do this," he said. "We don't have anywhere to go." Tracy appeared behind him, holding the baby on her hip. Her face was pale. "Daniel, what is this?" He didn't look at her. "She's kicking us out." "I'm reclaiming my home," I said softly. "The one you tried to steal." Marilyn came in from the kitchen, her voice trembling. "Margaret, think of the baby. This is cruel." I met her eyes. Cruel was locking me in the basement of my own house. Cruel was pretending I was losing my mind. The officer stepped forward, his tone polite but firm. "You're being asked to leave the premises within 30 days. You can contest the decision legally, but you cannot remain here beyond that period." Daniel's voice cracked. "You don't understand. Officer, this is my mother. She doesn't know what she's doing." Olivia's tone cut clean through the air. "She knows exactly what she's doing, Mr. Cooper, and she has every legal right to do it." The officer placed a copy of the notice on the entryway table. "You've been served," he said quietly. The silence that followed felt thick, almost physical. Tracy's face twisted in disbelief. Daniel looked at the floor, his shoulders hunched. The baby began to fuss. Small cries, filling the space none of us could fill with words. Finally, I spoke. "Daniel, when your father died, I thought I had lost everything. Then I learned I still had you. I believed that meant I wasn't alone. But I was wrong. You left me long before you tried to take this house. You left when you decided power mattered more than love." He didn't respond. His face was tight, pale. The boy I raised was somewhere in there, but I couldn't see him anymore. The officer nodded politely to me and stepped outside. Olivia lingered, her eyes meeting mine with quiet strength. "I'll follow up with the court this afternoon. You've done what needed to be done." After they left, I sat down on the piano bench. The silence settled again, softer now. Daniel and Tracy went upstairs, voices muffled but tense. Drawers opened and closed. Suitcases thudded on the floor. For a moment, I almost went up to stop them. I almost told them to stay, to talk, to try again. But then I saw the stack of forged papers on the coffee table. The faint mark of my name in someone else's handwriting. The impulse passed. By afternoon, their things were gone. Daniel came down one last time, standing awkwardly in the doorway. His voice was low. I never meant to hurt you. I met his eyes, searching for the truth, but found only regret. You did anyway, I said. He nodded, looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, and then walked out without another word. The moment the door shut, a strange stillness filled the air. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was something close. Later that evening, Olivia called to confirm that everything was recorded officially. Daniel's license was suspended, pending investigation. The house title was secured in my name again. I thanked her, and she said, "Now you can rest." After hanging up, I walked down to the basement. The lamp still glowed softly in the corner. The air smelled faintly of detergent and dust. I sat on the edge of the bed where I'd spent so many nights awake. Afraid. Waiting. It didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a reminder of what I had survived. I ran my hand across the quilt, tracing each seam. I remembered sewing it when Daniel was little, his hands sticky with jam as he played beside me. That memory didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. It felt almost kind. Upstairs, I opened every curtain, every window. The house breathed again. Evening light spilled through the rooms, touching the framed photographs along the wall. Frank's smile, Daniel's baby face, mine beside them, younger and hopeful. The wind moved through the open windows, lifting the curtains like gentle ghosts. I stood there, watching the sunlight fade, until the first stars appeared. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. The world kept turning, ordinary and unbothered, as if it hadn't just witnessed my life being rewritten. I closed the front door softly and turned the lock. This time, it wasn't to keep anyone out. It was to keep myself in. Safe. Grounded. Finally home. When I went to bed that night, the silence was no longer heavy. It was mine. The following morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the window panes. It was steady, gentle, the kind that makes you want to stay in bed a little longer. I stared at the ceiling, realizing that for the first time in months, I didn't feel that dull weight in my chest. There were no footsteps upstairs, no whispers through the vents, no tension hiding behind closed doors. The house was truly mine again. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. The garden below looked washed clean, the roses bending under the drizzle. For a long while, I just stood there breathing, letting the quiet wrap around me. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I hesitated, then opened the door to find Olivia holding a folder and wearing a rare smile. Behind her stood a man I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. His hair was grayer now, but his eyes were the same deep brown. "Margaret," Olivia said, stepping aside. "This is Tom Reynolds from the county assessor's office. He came to finalize the verification of your property." I blinked, then smiled. "Tom Reynolds. I haven't seen you since the neighborhood barbecue in '04. He chuckled softly. "You still remember that? My wife burned every burger on the grill." "I remember, because I was the only one who ate one," I said. The laughter came easily, surprising me. Olivia handed me the folder. "Everything is officially settled. The fraud case is closed. Daniel's license has been revoked permanently. And you have full legal protection on your estate. They can't contest any part of it." Relief washed over me like warm sunlight after a storm. So that's it, she said. You're free to move forward however you want. I thanked her. And after they left, I sat at the table with the folder open in front of me. Every page bore my name, my signature, my authority. It wasn't about the paper, it was about the proof. Proof that I hadn't imagined the betrayal. Proof that I hadn't lost myself. Later that afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I went into the sewing room. It was dusty and cluttered with forgotten projects. Fabric stacked in uneven towers. Thread spools long faded. I turned on the lamp. The one with the yellow shade Frank had bought me when I first opened my shop. The soft light filled the room. And I felt something stir inside me. I picked up a half-finished quilt from the table. The pattern one I had designed the year Daniel was born. Tiny squares of deep blue and burgundy, stitched into the shape of a rising sun. My hands moved slowly at first, then with more certainty. The rhythm of the needle was grounding, like breathing. Stitch by stitch, the silence began to feel like companionship instead of emptiness. By evening, the rain had stopped. The air outside was crisp and new. I walked out onto the porch, wrapped in a shawl, and watched the sun break through the clouds. For the first time in a long while, I thought about the future without dread. A car pulled up quietly to the curb. For a second, my stomach clenched. But then I recognized the silver sedan. It was Emily, my daughter. She stepped out, waving as she jogged up the walkway, her umbrella flapping in the wind. "Mom," she said, breathless but smiling. "You didn't tell me everything was done. I wanted to tell you in person," I said. "Come inside." She dropped her coat on the chair and hugged me tight. "I can't believe it's over." "It's over," I said. And this time, I believed it. We sat in the living room with tea, the scent of chamomile filling the air. Emily's eyes moved around the room, taking in the familiar details. "It feels different in here," she said. "Lighter." "It should," I replied. "There's no one left trying to control it." She smiled softly, then reached for my hand. "Have you heard from him?" "Not directly. Olivia said he's cooperating with the investigation." "That's more than I expected." Emily sighed. "He always wanted to be like Dad, but he never understood that Dad built everything with love, not with greed." I nodded. "He lost sight of that. Maybe now he'll remember." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of the city through the open window. It was peaceful, but I could feel something shifting inside me. Resolve forming. "Emily," I said finally, "I've been thinking about the house." Her eyes widened. "You're not selling it, are you?" "No," I said with a small smile. "I'm giving it purpose. There's an organization downtown, the Silver Circle Foundation. They help older women who've lost their homes, many after being taken advantage of by their families. I spoke to their director yesterday." Emily blinked, surprised. "You're donating the house? Not right away?" I said, "But eventually, I'll keep a small part of it for myself. Maybe the basement apartment. And let them use the rest for transitional housing. I've had my time here. It's someone else's turn." She looked at me, tears forming in her eyes. "Dad would be proud of you." "I hope so," I said softly. "He always believed the things we build should outlive us." That evening, after Emily left, I sat on the porch again, watching the lights of the city flicker to life. I thought about all that had happened, how easily love can turn to control, how quiet cruelty can hide behind the word family. But I also thought about how strength sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. The next morning, I woke early and drove downtown to meet with the foundation. The building was small but bright, filled with laughter and the scent of coffee. The women there were older, some my age, some younger, all carrying stories behind their eyes. I listened as one woman told me how her son had emptied her savings account while she was in the hospital. Another described being tricked into signing her own house away. When I told them my story, they didn't look at me with pity. They looked at me with recognition. We had all been through different versions of the same storm. By the time I left, I had made up my mind completely. I would turn this house that had been my cage and my fortress into a place of refuge. A home for women who needed to be reminded that they still mattered. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Daniel again. I didn't feel anger anymore. Just a quiet sadness. The kind that comes when you finally stop fighting the past. Somewhere, maybe, he was learning his own lessons. I could only hope so. I reached over to turn off the lamp, and the room filled with soft darkness. The rain had started again outside, steady and calm. I closed my eyes and listened, not afraid of what came next. For the first time, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Sunlight broke through the clouds the next morning and poured across the kitchen like a promise. I tied back the curtains, brewed coffee, and stood barefoot on the cool tile while the house breathed easy around me. The calendar on the wall told me what my heart already knew. Dedication Day. By evening, the Silver Circle women would fill these rooms with voices and plans. And this house would finally be more than a battle I survived. It would be useful again. I spent the morning in small rituals that steadied my hands. I polished Frank's tray until I could see my face in it. I set out the blue china that only came down for holidays. I clipped roses from the garden and arranged them in the old glass pitcher with the hairline crack that never quite reached the top. Every room received a vase. Every table got a cloth. I walked the halls and tested each window latch and light switch as if the building itself needed reassurance that the worst had passed. By noon, Emily arrived with sandwiches and a list longer than her arm. She moved through the house with cheerful authority, taping signs for coat storage, shifting chairs, fussing with the entry rug until it lay flat. She told me the foundation director would be here at 3, the city councilwoman at 4, the donors at 5, and the women who would live here as soon as the approvals cleared by the end of the week. She asked if I was ready. I told her I had never been more ready for anything in my life. Before the first knock, I went down to the basement. The lamp glowed softly in its corner. The quilts were folded in a neat stack. I touched the cool concrete and thanked the room that had held me steady when nothing else would. Then I climbed the stairs, smoothed my skirt, and opened the front door. They came in waves. Neighbors with curious eyes, donors with practiced smiles, a photographer from the local paper, careful with her steps as she backed through the hallway for a wider shot. The Silver Circle director, a compact woman with a silver bob and the stance of someone who had pushed through doors that did not open easily. She took both my hands and said this house would change lives. I felt the words settle into place inside me and make a home of their own. I gave a short speech in the living room because they asked for it and because I wanted to say the thing out loud. I told them this house had known love and laughter and also fear. I told them it had been a refuge and a cage, and that sometimes a place can be both. I said today we were choosing the first thing again. The faces around me softened. The director nodded. Emily stood at the back with her chin lifted and her eyes bright. The women who would move in next, one by one, drifted toward me. They told me pieces of their stories. A son who drained an account during a hospital stay. A niece who borrowed a name and never gave it back. A sister who slid papers across a table and said it was only routine. I listened the way I had begged to be heard. I promised them the locks worked. The rooms were theirs. The kitchen was open at all hours for tea and midnight toast. We laughed at that. Quiet, but real. William arrived a little later in his careful suit, with the pocket square he wore to every important thing. He placed a hand over his heart in greeting, a gesture that still made me smile. He said the neighborhood had been buzzing, and that the safe in his study felt lighter now that the deed was back where it belonged. He looked around and said the house seemed taller. I told him it did to me too. just before 5. While the last tray of cookies went out and the first notes of a piano piece threaded through the chatter, I saw Daniel through the screen door. He stood on the porch steps with his hands empty and his shoulders squared like a man bracing himself for weather. For a heartbeat, I could not make my feet move. Then I went to the entry, opened the door, and waited. He did not step inside. He asked if we could talk for a minute. His voice held none of the old authority, only a quiet that I had not heard from him since he was a boy coming home late and scared of disappointing me. I told him we could stand on the porch. He said he had received the final notice. He said his license was gone and that he had taken a job doing intake at a small firm while he figured out what came next. He said he had been to counseling twice and that the woman there used words like accountability and restitution and that he was trying to understand both. He told me he was sorry. Not as a defense but as a fact. He said he would pay back what he could. How he could. For as long as it took. I listened. I told him that nothing he did would erase what had happened. I told him I would not forget. And I would not move the lines I had drawn. I also told him I believed in work and in change if it showed up every single day without fanfare. He nodded and stared at his shoes, and then looked up the way he did when he was 6 and had skinned his knees and could not meet my eyes. He asked if he could send the baby a picture of the house when it was filled with women and noise, so that one day she would know what her grandparents chose when faced with a hard thing. My chest tightened. I told him Emily would help him get the photo when the time was right. He thanked me. He did not ask to come in. When he left, I stood very still and let the ache move through and past me. Back inside. The evening unfurled gently. The councilwoman gave a short remark about dignity and safety. The director raised a toast with ginger ale. The photographer asked me to sit at the piano. I placed my fingers on the keys and played the few measures I still remembered from years ago. The melody wobbled and then steadied. People turned toward the sound. When I finished, they clapped in that soft way that means, "Thank you for trying." I felt 10 years lighter. We toured the upstairs bedrooms with their pale quilts and sturdy dressers and sunlight pooling in the corners. We showed the kitchen with its long farmhouse table and the pantry labeled in big letters so no one had to ask where anything lived. We pointed out the back gate and the wide path and the small garden beds waiting for rosemary and thyme. By the time the last guest left, the house smelled of coffee and cookies and floral hand cream and something else I had not expected. Hope. Maybe. Clean and ordinary and strong. After the door clicked shut, Emily and I stacked plates and rinsed the last of the glasses. She touched my arm and asked if I was all right. I told her I was more than all right. I was tired and hungry and ready to sit with my feet up for the first time in months. She laughed and said that sounded like a plan and that she would be back in the morning with paint samples for the upstairs hallway. She kissed my cheek and left with a wave. I carried the final vase to the basement because that was where I wanted to end the night. The lamp still made its small circle of gold. I set the roses by the bed and sat down on the quilt I had pieced one winter when the world felt endless. I thought about the women who would sleep above me soon, each one carrying a story she would tell when she was ready. I thought about the moment a person decides to walk through the door of her own life and not ask permission anymore. I thought about Frank, humming off key in the kitchen, and the way the air in this house was finally light again. When I went back upstairs, I paused in the entry and looked up at the staircase. The wood gleamed where sunlight had hit it all day. The house felt taller still. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and breathed in the quiet. Tomorrow there would be paperwork and paint and lists that never ended. Tonight there was only peace. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. If any of it sounded like a piece of your own life, I hope you felt less alone for a while. Tell me what you would have done, or what you did. When someone tried to rewrite your story, share your thoughts, your questions, the moments that stayed with you. If you want more stories about women who refuse to disappear, stay with this channel and join the conversation. Your voice keeps these rooms full.